All right, so thank you for coming. I hope you had a great lunch. I really like the key lime little things. They were wonderful. So I'm Lori Haak. I'm the executive director of Orchid. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is persistent identifiers. We've talked a lot in the meeting today over the past couple days about managing data, but also in the huge amount of time and effort that's spent in that management of data. How do we tag the data after the fact? How do we create connectors to allow us to understand that this item in this data set is the same as this item in the other data set or is somehow related? That is a huge, expensive proposition. In many cases, it's not done, and it means that we end up with large amounts of data that are essentially unusable or inaccessible because we don't know what they are and the value to the various processes we're involved in. So. I was talking with Anita yesterday, and she's like, my dad always taught me to have informative, but also kind of fun presentations, so I thought I'd put this up. So alert, this presentation is all about plumbing. And I think this is one of the hardest things about the position that I have with Orchid is that really Orchid is a piece of plumbing in our data infrastructure. And most people really don't want to talk about plumbing. They want to talk about more fun stuff. They want to talk about analysis. They want to talk about that really cool talk this morning about Ancestry.com was really neat. But he didn't really talk about plumbing. There's a lot of plumbing that goes on behind the scenes in all of these different data infrastructures that enables us to do the analysis. And so Orchid is a piece of the plumbing. But as I say here, it's not sexy. But I think we can all agree that flushing toilets and running water are something that we want to have, that we need to have in a civilized society. So bear with me through this talk about plumbing. So what are persistent identifiers? So they're numeric or alphanumeric persistent designations that are machine readable. Okay, this is what I'm talking about when I mean persistent identifier. The are also resolvable. This is really, really important. We're not just talking about a number. We're talking about a resolvable persistent identifier, so that if you click somehow on this identifier, it will resolve back to a source document or a source entity. Now, the entity can be anything from an organization to a person to an artifact, okay, meaning a work, a paper, a data set, etc. Okay, person, place, and thing. So why do we care about this? What do they do exactly? Persistent identifiers enable machine readability, right? In today's digital age, things have to be machine readable. They enable disambiguation and they enforce uniqueness. How do we know if this is the same as this? Well, if they have the same ID, we do. And they also enable linking and data integration. And the great term interoperability. Persistent identifiers are absolutely critical for interoperability. So persistent identifiers provide a simple basis for digital data governance and what we need for interoperability. So remember that, digital data governance. Plumbing. So one use case. Something that's near and dear to my heart, publishing research findings. People think about publishing, I have a research finding, I'm going to write it up in a paper, I'm going to submit it to a journal, and then it's going to be published and people will read it. Simple, right? Well, there's all kinds of things you want to know in that process that can be enabled if you include persistent identifiers in the process. Now, Nita's talked about some of them, the Research Resource Initiative. We've had other people talk about digital labs, online labs. How do we understand what antibody was used? If you want to reproduce an experiment, you actually have to know what the antibody was that was used, right? If it was an experiment with an antibody. How do you know about the protocol? Wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of identifier that can point you back to the actual protocol? Grant ID, who funded it? Which organization funded it? Which grant funded it? And we're talking about open access. How do we know who should have access to an article? How do we know if the article should be open access as mandated by a funder? If we don't know that this thing that you published was actually supported by funding agency X, grant Y, right? And then, is there a data set associated with it? Who wrote it? Who's the author? Who are the set of authors? Author names are particularly difficult. They're name strings. They're not machine readable. All of these things go into the manuscript submission process. All of these things I wrote up here all have existing standard identifiers in the community that can be adopted now. Now we go then to manuscript submission. There's a review process. How do we identify reviewers? How do we encourage reviewers? Wouldn't it be great if there was some way to acknowledge reviewers? Well, maybe reviewers should have an ID too. Maybe the review itself should have an ID. We have the manuscript acceptance. We want to know who the co-authors are right now. In the publishing realm right now, many, many times the co-authors are not uniquely identified. They're not actually asked specifically for permission to be a co-author. So they're put on a paper, and some find out much later, wait a second, why am I on this paper? I had no idea it was on this paper. Wouldn't it be great if we had some way in here to validate and verify who the co-authors are? And then we have the manuscripts published. Well, it doesn't just sit there. It goes out and is indexed by any number of different systems. Well, in many cases, in journals, the manuscript receives something called a digital object identifier. It's a handle that allows you to uniquely resolve back to the source document. So that's published with the manuscript, and that's submitted to something called Crossref, right? And so you can navigate back to the source document, but imagine if Crossref also stored these other identifiers, or the source document would be associated with metadata for these source identifiers. It can really make a difference in the kinds of information you can get about a document, about the process, about who funded it, all of these other things you want to know if this kinds of information is collected in a machine-readable format. It's already in the document. It's just done right now in a way that doesn't support digital understanding. All right, so this is what we're talking about. Let's move on. So I'm going to go into raw and get you guys all excited. So the instant you leave here, you're going to go back and either do it yourself or tell your IT people to make sure your systems have identifiers in them. Okay, that's my goal today. So there's similar issues of tracking, who gets credit, and also trust that exists throughout the research ecosystem. So today I'm really focusing on research and development, primarily academic, but commercial is included in this space. How do we bring identifiers into this concept of making our work, making our contributions public? So we have issues of tracking and trust with data sets, with annotation, with metrics and evaluation, with review processes, collaboration. All of these things would benefit from having persistent identifiers. So back to plumbing. Plumbing. So we hopefully agree that it's desirable. I would say it's necessary. And I don't know about you, but I love going to Home Depot and just kind of staring at the big walls of things and, oh, I could make this and I could do that and all these other things. So we like to do it. It's something desirable, something we might like to engage in. But I realize that it requires design. It requires change. It requires cooperation. It means you have to get on the phone and talk to people. And it requires work to implement these standards. Somebody earlier today during Anita's talk asked, well, where do we go to engage in these standard processes? There's already 26 standards. I don't want a 27th one. How do we know what to do? Okay? So it takes time. It takes thoughtfulness. It takes some amount of ruthlessness. And who has patience for all of this, right? You've got other things you need to be doing. Why? So why do it? Because it's a problem that needs to be addressed. We cannot continue to move on the way we're going now without instituting some method of bringing order into the chaos in our information systems. So the particular problem that we address at ORCID has to do with name ambiguity for people. So I'll talk about that for a little bit, and then I'll move a little bit more broadly about why we as a community should care about persistent identifiers. So this is one slide that I almost always show when people talk about, well, why should we care about identifiers for people? So, and this really focuses on, again, the research community, and I'm going to read a couple of these. So on the top, actually, I guess I can use it. On the top here, there's a little thing. Of the more than 6 million authors in a major journal citations and abstract database, more than 2/3 of them, 2/3 of 6 million, share a last name and a single initial with another author in that database. 2/3. So are they the same person? Are they not the same person? I don't know. It's hard to tell. So an ambiguous name in the same database refers to an average of 8 people. So anyone trying to understand linkages, information flows, who's funding what, any evaluation scheme, you get nowhere because of this kind of ambiguity of the name database. You also have Declan. Declan over here is trying to find an old friend from 30 years ago named Dave Jackson, right? He can't find this guy. There's no way. You can't just do a Google search and try to find these people because there's about, I don't know, 1 million different returns you get for Dave Jackson. Wouldn't it be great if when you did that search, that behind the name was an identifier, and at least you got tabbed entries so you knew that this one was this Dave Jackson and this one was that Dave Jackson, and you could find yours instead of having to sift through them all? We've also got Julie Banfield, who got married. All of the publications she put out before she got married have a different name on them. It's really, really hard for her to bring all of her stuff together. How do you do that when everything's based on a name string? Where do you go to register your new name? We've got Jens Age Merit Sorensen, who's in Denmark. This poor guy has over 50 different iterations of his name out there in public on different versions of publications, grants, etc., because he's got 4 names, special characters. It's a mess. So anyone searching for him has to know all 50 different versions of his name to find his stuff, and who wants to take the time to do that? We've got Julie Vanderhoop. The folks in the Netherlands have a lot of fun with their Vanders. Which one's the last name? Is it the Van, is it the Dare, or the Hoop? What is it? I don't know. And so it's really, really complicated to find her stuff. And then you have Sumit Gupta. When he looks up PubMed for his name, he's over 10,000 search results come back. Who has the time to figure out what's his? And he can't fix it, right? It's incredibly frustrating for the authors, for the researchers, and it's incredibly frustrating for the people who want to use the data to inform decisions. So there is a need for us to engage with standards. So what's ORCID? So ORCID is a nonprofit organization. We were founded a little over 3 years ago now. We provide a non-proprietary registry where individuals, anyone in the audience here, can come to orchid.org/register. It works on your little handheld, and register for your own unique identifier. Okay? It requires very little time to register. It's a public ID. We do not associate the ID with personal information. The closest we get to personal is your email address. You control privacy and what information is linked and what information is displayed. So it is your ID. You travel with it wherever you go. We do not link it to financial information. We don't want that. This is really a way to say, this is me, this is my identifier, and these are the things I do in public that are related to research. Okay? And I'll tell you a little bit more about how that works. So for my ID-centric version of the world, the person ID is in the middle, and there's all kinds of other IDs that ORCID links to. Okay? So our goal is to serve as a registry, but also a hub that links this person identifier, again, to the things that you do in public. So how do you link to your funding? Well, through links between your ORCID identifier and your grant ID, your ORCID identifier and the ID for your funding organization. How do you link to your publications? Through a link between your ORCID ID and the DOI or the handle on your publication. Okay? How do you link to your professional association? Well, by linking your ORCID ID with your member association identifier, okay? Or your abstract ID that you presented at that meeting. All kinds of ways of linking. So we're the identifier registry itself, and then these APIs that enable these linkages between you and resolvable other identifiers. We do not store publications. We don't want the content. We provide that kind of linking pointer service to enable you guys, whoever wants to consume the data, to go to the source document and do the mining if you want. All right. We also link to other person identifiers. So this is, again, to address that question of what about the other 26 standards out there. There is probably not going to be any one answer to any of these blue circles on here. There's different needs in different communities. But what we can do when we develop these standards is to be thoughtful about how to provide services that enable standards to point to each other. So there are other existing person identifiers. One is called ISNI. One's called Researcher ID. It's provided by Thomson Reuters. One's called Scopus Author ID, provided by Elsevier. And there are also internal identifiers, for example, your NIH Commons ID. You may have a faculty ID or an employer ID. Any number of other identifiers can be linked to an ORCID identifier. Some of those links are made public on the ORCID page, And some of them are resident inside your system. So what we're seeing universities do, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is actually taking the ORCID ID and posting it into their faculty or staff or human resources registries at the university behind their firewall. So they can then use that identifier as a way of linking multiple systems across the university. Their library access, other kind of research access, all kinds of other systems at the university enabled links between those using that one identifier. All right, so where are we? This is my little ad. We have been out for about 2 years now with our registry. We're getting close to 1 million. We should hit 1 million in about a month of people that have come and registered for an ORCID identifier. What I want to point out here again is rah community. The large darker blue section on the bottom, those are the individuals who have registered for an identifier because they've encountered the request to register through another organization. So for example, a publisher asking an author to register for an ID when they submit a paper, okay? The idea there being the identifier becomes a part of that paper and is published as part of the metadata when that paper is published, okay? Funders asking for applicants to include their ORCID identifier when they submit a grant. Again, that identifier becomes a bit of the metadata on the awarded grant. This is what we're talking about. It's not about an individual saying, I did this. It's an individual including that identifier in a workflow, in a process, in a system. So it becomes embedded in the document. And there's provenance associated with it and review associated with it, so that from a data consumer's perspective, you can trust and verify this information. All right, so in addition to person names, we've talked about ORCID. In addition to person names, there are obviously ambiguity issues with all kinds of other names. Names for documents, artifacts, and also names of organizations. ORCID interacts with both of these, but we don't do them, okay? So just to be clear, this is a nice piece from Wellcome Trust. They did a study on open access. You have a lot of funders that are mandating that publications that come out of or are supported by federal funding or have to be made available to the public outside of a publisher firewall. And what they found was this is a great idea, but if you don't have a way of tracking who the author is, who the funder is, what the grant was, you can't enforce open access. So there's been a real work here to figure out not just who the author is, but how can we enforce standards for naming as well. So my main message, if you remember nothing else from this, remember ORCID, register, become a member, but also we can't do this alone. Everyone has to be involved in this process. We have to take a community approach to embedding. Next slide is somebody asked a question about who. There's a number of different organizations here that we're involved with. There's CASRA, there's DataCite, there's Eurocris, there's Force 11. It depends on which community you're part of, which one of these different organizations you will engage with or should best engage with to work on specific standards problems that you have, or just to learn about which standards you should be using. Okay, the to-do list. I see I have 6 minutes left. So 3 things. 3 things. Integrate these data fields. When you're designing your systems, make sure you have data fields to store persistent identifiers for people, places, and things. My main push is people. Let's get started with people. Make sure you have a data field. It should be a data field that stores the identifier and the type, the little pieces, okay? You need to collect these identifiers during your workflows. You need to embed that collection into workflow processes. When you're collecting person identifiers, please, please, please never allow people to type these things in. Bad idea. You have to use authentication. You have to use logins. We actually provide public APIs to support this. We'd like you to use the member one, but you can do it using authentication. Do it the right way. Don't let people type this stuff in, because then you end up with typos and we're back where we started. Make sure people are authenticating these identifiers. And the third one is incorporate them into the things you publish, whether that's a data set or an API call or anything. Make sure that you provide access to that metadata that you have. Okay, very quickly, I want to take you through who's using ORCID and how they're using it, so you get a sense of kind of a variety of stakeholders involved in this and the depth of ways that they're thinking about integrating ORCID identifiers. So we've got publishers, research funders, professional associations, universities and other research organizations, as well as repositories and other vendors. So I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Publishing. So we have publishers that are not only taking the ORCID ID when you submit a manuscript, they're also publishing it in the manuscript. So I think this is the right one. Here we go. Right here, you can see that ORCID ID is actually now underneath the author line. Okay? They're also starting displaying it in large index sites. So this is Scopus. They're now showing the ORCID ID, and you can search their index using ORCID identifiers. Not just name strings anymore. You can now do machine-readable searches. Okay? There's also all kinds of stuff that we publish on how publishers can integrate with us. And let's see here. Also, this is not just in science. It's also in modern languages, so social sciences and humanities are using this as well. So it's across the spectrum of fields, different publishers using this. We also have this idea, well, there's a lot of people who spend a lot of time reviewing, and reviewing is an important, fundamental component of how we validate research information. So there's also a huge push now to figure out how do we acknowledge peer review activities, and ORCID is part of this as well. Who's the reviewer? How can we acknowledge them in a validated, provenanced way? So publishers, as well as platforms like Faculty of 1000 and Science Open, are starting to integrate ORCID identifiers into review processes. This is pretty exciting. We also have single sign-on here, getting into peer review, signing on with your ORCID ID, using what's associated with your ORCID identifier as ways of qualifying reviewers. Funding. A number of funders are using ORCID identifiers. We have 2 that are requiring the use of ORCID identifiers during grant application processes, and more that are coming. And this is not just in the US. I should point out this is around the world. Okay? So we've got Sweden, Ireland is not mentioned on here. The US, both NIH and DOE are using ORCID identifiers. FDA is as well. And we've also got adoption in Asia and Pacific Rim countries. Professional associations have many, many different databases that don't talk to each other very well. They publish, they have membership, they have meetings. How do we know if somebody who publishes with them is also a member, is also somebody who presents at a meeting, or maybe has an award? They're looking at ORCID as a key across these different data sets that enable them to allow this information to flow. They're starting to, this is a geophysical unit implementing ORCIDs in member records, their editorial databases, and their papers. So this is all parts of the research community really working to embed these identifiers for people. It's, again, not just about people, it's about organizations, it's about the content as well, but people are very, very fundamental to making all of these things flow. All right, universities. I don't know how many of you have ever gone through promotion and tenure. I have talked to too many people that spend here, this nice guy, and I like stealing stuff from Twitter. Hour number 2 of entering and updating my publications indicate that they were published and refereed. Well, why should you have to do this? Right? They're already published. There's already a DOI. They've already been through review. Why should you have to re-enter this data? I had somebody who spent 3 days on a promotion and tenure case getting all of his data together to present. Why? Why should it take that much time? You should be spending your time doing your research and scholarship and teaching, not spending 3 days putting together a P&T case. So what ORCID can do, as this person says, in an alternate universe, another you just typed in his ORCID, linked it all up, and went for a run. We can use these persistent identifiers to enable information to flow between systems and prevent people from wasting their time doing duplicative data entry, and also, frankly, improve the quality of information. Right? Somebody was arguing, why should I have to worry about what format to put my footnotes in? Well, you shouldn't. You should just really have to have your DOI there, and then whatever parser is on that page can decide how it wants to present the information. You shouldn't have to do that. All you should have to know is the DOI for the content. All you should have to know is the ORCID for the person, and then let the information flow between systems. That's what we're trying to do here. Repositories. All kinds of places store data. A lot of part of what we're talking about here is repositories. And they're working on building in support for how do you submit data and curate data involving explicit collection of information on who's contributing that data set and their contributor role. And so ORCID has been integrated into processes across a number of different repository structures. All right, that's my last slide of 21 seconds. I'm so thrilled. So for more information on ORCID, orchid.org, it's very simple. It's a free website. We have technical documentation. Our code is all open source. You're welcome to check it out, contribute. We have a support. If you want to contact us, just contact us at support@orchid.org. And there's the registration thing. So many uses, painless to get one. Thank you.